Hello and welcome to this edition of the Employee Engagement Webcast. My name is Jason Lortzen and I am your host and resident employee engagement geek. Before we get started today, I do want to put a disclaimer out there that this is a re-recording. In fact, this is not the original webcast that we broadcast live last week. I failed and it ended up not being recorded, and this conversation was too important and too meaningful, we thought, to not have a recording. And so thankfully my guest was very gracious and agreed to do a do-over with me today. And so that's what you are about to watch. We hope that this one will be even better than the first and maybe even go a little bit deeper. So about the webcast, the reason we created this webcast was to host conversations to help us understand and do better work in the work of engaging employees and creating human workplaces. And in the past, I've hosted many guests who have shared with us stories about their work in creating work experiences and practices that drive employee engagement. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. And it requires a little background, I guess, to understand how we got here. A few years ago, when I was speaking at a conference, I was sitting in on a keynote where a woman was speaking about gender equality in the workplace, and it really had an impact on me. And as I listened to her, I realized a couple of things that day. Number one, she defined feminism as a belief that everyone should have equal opportunity regardless of gender. I don't know that I had ever heard feminism defined that particular way, but that made sense to me. And before that day, I don't know that I would have necessarily labeled myself as a feminist, but in hearing that definition, I thought, that's exactly what I believe. So it turns out I am a feminist, and I wear that label now proudly. The other thing that I realized that day is how profoundly ignorant I am about issues related to gender equality in the workplace and beyond. Despite having good intentions, it became clear I was pretty clueless. And so I set out to educate myself, to become much less ignorant, hopefully. Much of my learning has come through conversations that I've had with, as I was starting to think more about this, I started asking more questions. And so I had a lot of conversations with people who have had very different experiences with me, most of them women, but most of them have very different very different perspectives and experiences, and that helped me start to learn. And I have to be honest, at first when I started having these conversations, they were pretty uncomfortable. I was often nervous about, I didn't want to ask the wrong question, I didn't want to say the wrong thing, but it was too important not to have the conversation. And so as I pushed through that feeling of vulnerability, I guess, I started to have some amazing conversations and I started to learn a lot. And the more that I had these conversations, the easier they got, the more comfortable they got, and hopefully the less ignorant I got. I feel like I'm getting less ignorant all the time, but I still have a long way to go. And so this brings us kind of to today. Past couple years have brought these issues, or brought issues not only of gender equality, but sexual harassment and sexual violence in the workplace and beyond, kind of to the forefront. We can't ignore them any longer. And as I've been having conversations with people recently about these things, it's become pretty clear to me that one of the biggest challenges that we face is ignorance. Not only our own ignorance, like what I'm confronting, but also ignorance in others. We need more learning. We need more conversation. And so today, I've invited my friend, Heather Bussing, to join me for a personal and open conversation about these issues. Our goal over the next hour is to, not necessarily answer every question that you might have about this issue, but rather to promote some learning. And we think maybe most importantly, we want to model how to have a constructive conversation in a positive way about these issues. So let me bring up, there we go, bring up Heather. Heather's a longtime friend. We've been friends and colleagues now for a number of years. She's been practicing employment law for over 30 years. She's a terrific writer and photographer and an all-around beautiful human being. I'm so grateful to have her here with me today for take two of this conversation. Not only did I get 1 hour, I get 2 hours of conversation. So Heather, good morning. Welcome to the webcast. You know what? Why don't I toss it to you to give us a little, give us a little more about you. Whatever else you'd like us to know about you that you think might be important to our conversation today, and also to share your thoughts about why you were interested in joining this conversation, not only once, but twice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe the best way to do it is to give you a little context about what it was like for me growing up, because I was a little kid during the civil rights movement of the 60s, and coming into my teenage years during the women's rights movement of the 70s. And, my favorite T-shirt at the time said, "A woman's place is in the House and in the Senate." But there weren't many senators, right. And there weren't many female judges, and there weren't many women law firm partners. So my class in law school was the first time the school had had more women than men. Wow. By one person. And there were some female professors, but it was just a handful. And so I sat in my small section and looked at the framed photographs of all of the students who had passed through the halls, and it was all men. And so we were told, because it was the women's rights movement, that we could do anything and be anything we wanted, but nobody knew how to show us how to do that. And we were hearing it from our mothers and other women, but they were still trying to figure out how it worked. And because men had the power and the authority and control over resources, we had to ask permission, to step forward in the world. And that's what we knew. That's how we had always operated. And so we tried very hard to outmen the men. And we started dressing like men, and we started acting like men, and we started trying to compete with men as men. And while we were having babies, while we were still taking care of the house, while we were doing all of the other traditional women's work. And so we got very tired very fast.
No doubt.
So we're in a second wave of this. And in 1986 was when the United States Supreme Court recognized sexual harassment as being a form of gender discrimination and said, this is illegal. And that was about the time that I was graduating from law school and starting to work for law firms full of men. Lawyers often don't believe that the rules apply to them. Sometimes. But in this case, it was certainly true. And women were seen more as accessories, than colleagues. And we were given paralegal work, and not really included on the trial teams and not really included on the big deal. And then when the sexual harassment lawsuits started, the men became afraid to work with women because they were terrified of being accused of sexual harassment while they were continuing to sexually harass people.
Right.
And so I got into lots of crazy situations with male partners, there was a partner who insisted that all women on his team wear skirts and heels because he would slip his hand up their skirts. And I was on a project on the East Coast, but I was coming from the California office, and California had just enacted a statute that said it was legal for women to wear pants to work.
Mm.
We needed a law.
Mm.
So that's sort of the history and the context from somebody who lived through that time. And we look at it now and we go, wow, that's crazy. And I would just like to take a moment to notice that is evidence of how far we've come.
Sure.
We have come far, and the world is changing. And I think part of what we're seeing politically right now is the backlash to that.
Right.
And it's an attempt to turn back time to a different time when women knew their place in society.
Right.
But we will never go back. That's not how history works. That's not how human rights works. And the truth is, it's better for everyone when anybody can have any role in a family or at work, and we can all share the load.
Absolutely.
Our relationships with our children and our families and each other benefit from that. And so as I see a more inclusive world, I don't see that as a battle against men. I see it as making a bigger table where there's room for everyone.
Sure.
So it's, what I would like to find a way to avoid is the whole pensification of the workplace that I experienced when there was a wave of women's rights, because we've come too far to segregate, and doing that is illegal. It is gender discrimination, and we're not afraid to say that anymore.
Right. We need more conversation, right?
We need more conversation.
Not less conversation, more conversation. Not less engagement, more engagement. So before I get to my first question for you, I do want to share a couple quick thoughts. I do want to acknowledge right up front in this conversation that we recognize that gender is a much broader topic than what you and I are going to talk about today. Our discussion that we're going to have is going to be grounded in our own experiences. And so because of that, it's going to be limited, and we recognize those limitations. I want to recognize and maybe remind everyone that's listening to this that gender isn't simply a male-female issue. Trans and gender nonconforming people suffer harassment, abuse, and sexual violence at least what I think is a horrifying rate, and I think you will too. For example, according to the National Center for Transgender Equality, 47% of trans people say they experience sexual violence sometime during their lives. Like that is horrifying when you think about it. And so I wanted to pause and remind both us and everybody listening that confronting this issue that we're talking about today, gender in the workplace and beyond, isn't just about safety and equal opportunity for women. It's about creating safety and equal opportunity for all people, regardless of gender or race or sexual orientation or any other difference. So that being said, let me frame up here what we're going to do. Heather and I are going to chat now for the next 30 or 40 minutes, a little back and forth. And then we are going to address, we had a question or two from our live web chat that we are going to bring back and talk about here because there were some really good perspectives that were shared. We're going to tackle as much as we can in the next, it looks like 45 minutes that we have to make it valuable and hopefully spark you to think about some conversations that all of you who are listening might have back in your own spheres of influence or workplaces. So Heather, let me start with this. because I think, part of the reason that we are having this is due to, what's happening societally. It's the Me Too and the Time's Up movements that have really sort of amplified this conversation. So what do you think, most people maybe are misunderstanding about Me Too and Time's Up?
Well, Me Too was about speaking up and saying, I have been harassed. And the point of it was to show how pervasive the issue is in our culture and in our workplaces. And it was bigger than I think even many women expected. And Time's Up is about raising your voice and raising your hand and saying, let's find a way to change this. Because as long as we're silent, we're complicit in our own oppression. But it takes tremendous courage to talk about things that we feel ashamed of and embarrassed about and have been told is our fault.
Right.
One of the ways that sexual harassment victims are oppressed is they're blamed. It's your fault because you were wearing a short skirt. It's my fault because I had a couple drinks.
Right.
It's there. The victim is almost always blamed. And in sexual harassment situations within organizations, the focus, once it becomes known, and most often it is not known. The EEOC estimates that 73% of claims are never filed. Right. No one ever says anything about it because there's so much at stake. This is people's lives and careers and the ability to pay the bills.
Right.
So the power dynamics are intense. But once you do make a claim, then the focus becomes completely on the man and whether or not they did it. And nothing is done to care for the victim, who has just done one of the bravest things she's ever done in her life. And often when harassment is, even when it's found, it's the victim who has to change jobs.
Yeah.
If the organization keeps the supervisor, and it's, that's the definition of sexual harassment, is there's some power or supervisory relationship. Then the organization, rises up to protect them. It's a liability issue. It's, it becomes adversarial. And the person who has been harmed is blamed and alienated and often retaliated against because they're seen as a threat. And so, we've created a system where discrimination and harassment are seen as a threat to our organization, right, rather than as an ideal and a goal and something to overcome and aspire to do it a different way.
Well, I've also heard you say to me in these conversations about this that, one of the things that people, like immediately get wrong about this is that it's not about men.
Right. Right.
Right. Talk more about that.
Well, we had this great comment by our dear friend Charlie in last time, and I was talking about all women, feeling anxious about the election after the Hollywood Access tape, and I was making categorical statements about men and women, and Charlie jumped in and said, "Hey, shouldn't we notice that not all men do this?" And and don't we have categories, of women who might not feel this way? And wouldn't it be good to acknowledge the fact that generalizations are dangerous territory? And I think his point was exactly that, and it was done with care and in the spirit of broadening the conversation and being more inclusive and not demonstrating the very bias that we're trying to talk about here.
Right.
And I, we both know Charlie, and we could hear that comment in the spirit it was given, but it also made me crazy.
Right.
It made me absolutely crazy, because the minute you start talking about how you're talking about things, it's a classic way of diverting it from the real topic.
Right.
And the idea that that in talking about something that's difficult to talk about, I have to be concerned about the good guys out there whose feelings might be hurt when I talk about bad things that other men did, pissed me off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wasn't upset with Charlie, but it's an example of how our systems and conversations and orientations are all skewed to see things from men's perspective. And
right.
And that we need men's permission, or we must make sure that the men that we're talking to are okay before we can say something further.
Right.
Is part of the problem.
It is interesting. I love that comment, or that when we start talking about or defining or setting ground rules for how we talk about things, like you've lost the point. I mean,
right.
And I find that so interesting. Like, well, let's not talk about it in a way that makes certain people, and it's usually certain people, meaning the men in the room, feel uncomfortable. It's like, well, what about, like, women have been uncomfortable in every conversation for the last 100 years at work.
Right.
Like, let's not be so damn sensitive, right? That's part of why
right.
we're here today, is that you've got to be able to, and that's one of the learnings, one of the big things for me that I've had to realize is that when you get into these conversations, like, if you are a good guy, you're going to feel like, you feel shame for your entire side of the, your entire group of people that identify with the same gender you do. I feel shame on the part of all men. I feel embarrassed. And there's times where I have been part of the problem, particularly, and there's times I recognize, and you've got to be okay saying, you know what, that's like, if we start reacting and shutting down the conversation because we feel a little ashamed, it's perpetuating the exact same issue. It's just, we're now reacting to, like, we can't even have a conversation. Right. And we're asking women to put their career at risk over something, an illegal or, a safety, something that their personal safety has been violated. We're asking them to put that at risk in a conversation. I just find all of that really interesting. And it's why I think it's, part of the reason you and I wanted to have this conversation was right. to show that you can talk about it, and you're not going to get it right. I'm going to say something today that's not quite right, and you're going to say something that's going to offend some, but that's part of talking about real issues, right?
Right.
We got to be okay with that.
Right. Well, we've all been participants in doing it wrong for a very long time.
Right.
And we're waking up, and it's okay that we've been doing it wrong. It's just the way it was. And it's time to do it differently now. And so let's focus there.
Right.
Let's not spend all of our time blaming and saying you're doing it wrong.
Right.
That's a struggle for power in and of itself.
So let me ask a question then that I think will get us into some sort of advance, I guess, the understanding. But one of and this is a conversation that I ask this question a lot, and I try to read stuff about this, but what do you talk a little bit about, I know you've thought about this probably more than most people, but what do you think it's likely that either I don't understand, or let's say men in general wouldn't understand about how about what your experience of work, or let's stick in the realm of work, what your experience of work is like, or what, other women's experience of work is like. What is the gap, or what are the biggest gaps in perception that you think exist about where we just don't understand or don't understand yet?
Well, my favorite quote on that gets to the heart of this is a Margaret Atwood quote, which is that men are afraid that women are going to make fun of them. Women are afraid that men are going to kill them.
Mm.
And that's how different our realities are.
Right.
We walk through the world in smaller, more vulnerable bodies. We have a lot more at stake with sex. Pregnancy, right. Disease, death. These are the risks that we take, and so our orientations and how we deal with the world and each other are completely different. I mean, we had a great conversation in San Francisco about physical safety and where you walk and where you don't walk. And, you're a big, tall, guy with a boomy voice, and you told me I don't feel uncomfortable most places. Right. I'm fine walking alone. And, right. and, I overtipped my Uber driver because he didn't rate me.
Right.
Right. So our realities are really different. And I would love to know sort of what you've noticed from your perspective as these conversations have happened, and you've tried to pay more attention to what it's like to be female in the world.
Yeah, it's as I said, as you ask that question, you learn, you hear about things that for me, one of the things that I know I have spent the last probably couple of decades coming to grips with is just understanding all of the privileges I have in interacting with the world, in in work, in business, that I didn't earn at all. I just was born into them. I happen to be born white and male. I'm tall. I was lucky enough. I lucked into a nuclear family that built my confidence. I never had any idea. The only career that I thought I couldn't do was being a pilot, because I had an eye surgery when I was young, and my parents told me that they would never let me be a pilot because of my eyes. But other than that, I thought that I was capable of doing anything. And so I had all of these advantages. And as I've talked to women, just understanding how different that experience can be. Like when I walk into a room, people, and I shared, I think, a story with you about how I got some coaching early on in my career from a mentor who was a CFO in the company I worked for. And he was, this guy was a guy that he was probably a full foot shorter than I was. Really smart guy. I loved I just watching him navigate. He was just a great leader. And I remember him one day, he took me to lunch, and he said, you need to be aware of the wake that you have when you come into a room. And he talked about that. Like he said, when you're big and like that, he said, you sort of immediately, because you can kind of come in with this force of energy and force of will, and because of these natural things you have, you put people on the defensive. And so I've recognized this stuff for me. Part of it for me was first recognizing my own stuff. Right. And then I could start recognizing things like, being in meetings. Like I've talked to so many women about how, they get talked over, and ideas get, heard, ignored, and then stolen or repeated by a male colleague and acknowledged. And that kind of stuff, I'm sure, happened in front of me for years, and I had no awareness of it. And I was probably participating in it because I was so busy getting my own ideas on the table.
Right.
But as I got my own stuff out of the way, then I could start seeing some of that. And as I'd been told about it, I could see it. And then once I saw it, then I could start then I could actively try to interrupt, or I could actively start to try to do that. So there's been that. The other thing that I have been incredibly fortunate to have in my life is I've been lucky to be in professions that were dominated by women. I mean, I've spent 10 years in corporate HR, and so I worked for women and with women almost the entirety of my career. And I've been surrounded by some really strong, smart women. I'm married to someone who's amazing that has, helps teach me every day. And so because of this, like one of my favorite moments in my career, I remember as an early young manager, one of the women that worked for me one day, I remember her she came into my office. I'll never forget this. She came into my office, she closed the door, she sat down, and she looked at me and she said, "You're being a real asshole lately." And I said, and I mean, I just stopped. I just stopped because I'm like, what do you mean? Because clearly she knew that wouldn't be my intention.
Right.
But it was the way that I was treating people, the way that, I wasn't listening. I wasn't whatever I was. It just wasn't, all of it was bad. She was absolutely right. But and then she went on to help me understand. Right. And I've had that moment happen for me at different points. And I think one of the things that I'm thankful for, and that I wish more women would do, is this. I wish they would interrupt. I think one of the things is a lot of times maybe I'm naive in this, but I think that a lot of men, even in the moment, like they may seem defensive in the moment if you say, "You know what, that was inappropriate." But most of the time when I'm called on stuff, I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't doing it with malice or intention. It just,
Right.
And I've been so thankful so many times in my career to be called out or to be given feedback by my female colleagues, like, "Listen, that is not okay. What you just did is not okay. And here's why it's not okay." And I'm like, holy crap. Thank you for telling me, because I would have never wanted that to be the case. And so I think that's part of how, to your point about harassment, instead of it pushing us to opposite corners, we need to be having more of that kind of interaction, because otherwise it just perpetuates and it gets worse, or you get away with this, and you don't even mean like get away like it's like you were trying to, but it reinforces. So that for me, that's how it's, I don't know if I hit a lot of specific things, but just the marginalization that happens everywhere when you start looking for it, when you become aware of it, you see it everywhere.
Well,
and
I've had to notice it too. For the first time in my life, I'm working with an amazing content marketing team at ADP. As a contractor, I'm working with a complete team that is all women, all really smart and creative. And I came in from working with men. And so I found myself interrupting. I found myself cutting people off. I found myself doing all of the things that I had learned to do in a different environment. What's interesting is that I don't do that anymore, because I let the other person talk first, and I know that there'll be plenty of room for everyone to talk, and that I'll be heard. It's not people, we're all starting to listen to understand rather than to listen to reply. It's I think it's a shift in the culture in general as we start to pay attention to some of these things, because as the conversations have expanded to include other men in other teams, this is how it works there. And it's a really amazing thing. So, but it's a new experience for me.
Sure. I think that goes to, and I don't know that we'll get into it in depth today, but that this is it is a cultural issue. It is a leadership. It's an everything issue. It's
Yeah.
not, I think we can get a little wrapped up in kind of the nuance, or like one slice of this, whether it be sexual harassment or whatever, but this is so much broader and deeper than that in terms of building a culture that's inclusive and where everyone can find and have access to opportunities on equal footing.
Yeah.
Um,
But we're still in the anger, we've been in
yeah.
denial and now we're working our way into anger, and then we'll
Yes.
get into grief and acceptance,
Yeah.
all cultural change follows that, and it's a loop to loop. It's not ever a straight line.
Right.
There are times of progress and there are times when you slip back before you make the next leap. And we're in one of those transition times, I think, and things are always fraught.
Yeah.
And so everyone's a little uncomfortable while we learn to do things a new way. But I think
Got
it's
it.
important not to get stuck in the anger,
Right.
and to start to look at where do we want to be and how do we get there.
And I guess where I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be talking about, the sexual harassment and the sexual violence and these other things. Super, super important. But I guess what I think is, if we're going to be thinking solution, we have to be, so like I think about the meeting example for, like a common everyday place where marginalization happens, where women get stepped on, stepped over, silenced, whatever happens in the corporate meeting. And it's not about, it's the difference, I guess, in my mind. I think we need to be aware to think about, it's not that one a-hole. It's stepping back and saying, what is it about how we have communicated, about how we, or what, the standards and expectations we've set about how we're going to treat each other, that's allowing that a-hole to behave that way in this meeting and not be called out for it,
Right.
or that nobody seems to notice. Like, those are the kinds of, that's where I guess I see that my comment about culture, I think, is important. Is like, what is it in our culture that is enabling and facilitating that kind of behavior? And let's attack that. Let's fix that. So on that, I want to get into some, maybe go even another step deeper, because I'm talking about marginalization, and particularly, I think, I would guess that there are some people that listen to this and know exactly what that means, and there's probably some that don't. So can you share an example or two from your career where you specifically remember feeling marginalized, or that it was a very blatant sort of feeling of being marginalized by your male peers or in a particular situation, and kind of what happened and how you responded?
Well, last time I told this story, and I think I'll tell it again because most of the
Please
other
do.
ones involve sexual assault, and I'm just not comfortable
Fair.
talking
Fair.
about that
Fair.
on a recorded thing.
Fair.
So we were doing a several $billion deal at a time when $billion deals were really rare. And I was at the 13th floor, which was all conference rooms, in a big building in downtown LA. And it was a star chamber. I mean, just these gigantic chairs and this huge, huge conference room. And the chairs were so big that I could not get in or out of them without assistance. I was, I was not strong enough to move the chair. They were thrones. They were thrones.
Sure.
And so, I'm the only woman. I'm in my mid-20s. I'm there as, an associate, not a major person on the deal. And I have to go to the bathroom and I can't get out of my chair. And so I'm like trying to figure out if I can slink down under, and crawl out from under the table, or if I could maybe like fit through the hole in the side, under the armrest. and I'm in a skirt, and so gymnastics is not going to work. And so I have to ask for help. And what followed was a 10-minute discussion about who should help me, while one partner is talking, well, Joe over here, he's done a really good job this week, he should help her, and then, then we'll reward him with, dinner tonight, or so, it became a discussion in front of me about who was going to take me home that night, as though I were property, and as though it were a given. And at some point, I think I had to threaten to pee all over the chair before somebody, took pity on me, really, and let me out. And I was shaking all the way to the bathroom, and I was, I just remember sitting in there and crying and going, how am I ever going to have any sort of credibility or success as an attorney in this kind of environment? Right. I can't even sit in a damn chair.
Right.
and be present without being, I was at breakfast the other morning, and there was a little girl who walked in with her American doll, and it was lovely. And the maitre d' got a baby seat and scooted it up to the chair and put the doll in, as though she were a part of the table and a part of the family. And that's how I felt. I felt like I was just a doll being plopped into the seat, and that I, was given the seat or removed from the seat at someone else's will.
So what did you do? I'm curious, because if I'm listening to this, I know, because I asked you the other day, but what did you do when obviously at some point you had to come back to the meeting. Like, how did that play out?
Well, I didn't do anything. I came back, I sat down. I did not scoot my chair in. Nobody helped me. Nobody paid any attention. But what I would do differently this time is, I would probably take stock, and when I realized that I couldn't comfortably get in and out of the chair, I would ask for a different chair. Just avoid the situation entirely. But I could have never imagined it.
Right.
And when the banter started about taking me home, I would have said something, at that point, and not just sat there and taken it. I would have said, hey, nobody's taking me home. I choose who takes me home. I choose who I take home.
Right.
Stop it.
Right.
And let me out of this damn chair.
Right. So pull that out then too, because, not to the extent where you have, the throne room and you're literally trapped in a chair, but, little acts of marginalization happen every day in the workplace. What advice, or what did you, what advice would you share? Or what tactics do you use today when you either notice that might be happening, or like what can you share to maybe help those that are listening, or those that wrestle with this, or maybe are in a workplace where this happens to them regularly? What should they do?
Well, I think you have to call it out. And I think we all have to call it out. And not in a finger pointing, oh, you did it wrong. But hey, that doesn't work. Let's do it this way. Teach, not taunt is what I call it, because we all have to learn. Women need to learn how to speak up constructively, and men need to learn how to take constructive criticism, and vice versa. We all could work more effectively together, including men and men. The power dynamics are interesting. There's a lot that we that we put up with that doesn't have to be that way. I mean, we could communicate more effectively all the way across the board. And I think it starts with having healthy boundaries and saying, hey, that doesn't work for me. This is what does.
So why, one of the things, I guess, I don't know that I have a good understanding of this. My assumption from what I've heard is that, the question I have in my mind is, why haven't more women pushed back, spoke up over the years? And I'm assuming from what I've heard, it's fear. It's fear of retaliation. It's fear of marginalization. It's lots of fear.
The women get blamed. We get blamed.
And
when
so
we speak up, we get blamed.
Is that changing?
Yeah.
How much of that, I mean, and so, like today, for example, like I know, because a lot of things, a lot of bad corporate practice end up sort of being allowed to perpetuate over time because people convince themselves like, well, we can't do anything about it, or somebody tried to do something about it 10 years ago and that didn't go well. And so I'm not going to do anything about it today. How is it changing, if it's changing, and how much of today, for those that are still saying, man, this is too high risk for me, or this is too loaded, too high risk for me to speak up or me to push back, even on the small things, how much of that is real, how much of it is perceived? Like, where are we on that spectrum of as power is shifting or it being okay or more safe to push back?
Well, it's complicated. It's complicated. I think it has to do with power and generations. So our institutions are still run by older white men predominantly, and their reality of how the world works is different from how the world works for a whole lot of other people in the organization and in our culture. So we see, the 60-year-old white guys up here in the courts and the government and the CEO and the boardroom. But on the other hand, our organizations are full of 20 and 30-year-old people who don't believe the world is like this and who do work very effectively together much of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we focus too much on what's wrong, we're going to convince the people who are doing it right that they have a problem.
Right.
I don't know if that's actually true, but there are multiple layers, and things are changing already, and it's something that doesn't change just because you make a law or just because you make a policy or just because you make a rule. It changes as people begin to do things differently, and so. I think that things are changing, and that this is the jumping off point for another sort of opening and opportunity for change. But it's both worse than we thought and better than we thought.
Sure.
Is my sense.
Complexity is always, I guess it's always going to be messy as we're on our way to change. So one of the questions that's maybe related is, I'm sure you see, I mean, in interacting in a lot of different ways and different places, you'll see things happen, right? Or you'll experience things that happen that you could confront or you could call out. You probably, I'm guessing, don't have the energy or the wherewithal to confront all of them because that would be exhausting.
Right.
How do you choose when to confront? Like, how do you personally make that decision? Like, when is it time to call it out or confront it, and when do you let it go, and why? Like, how do you make those value trade-offs?
Yeah. Well, that depends too. There's the easy stuff where somebody makes an off-color comment and it's somebody that's a colleague or a peer or you're comfortable with, and you go, yeah, no,
Right.
quit it. Not
Right.
funny.
Right.
Not funny. And that's easy. And then there are the times when you can step in for someone else. And I think that's easier for many of us to help and defend our friends than it is to do for ourselves, because we
Sure.
don't feel quite as vulnerable and we don't have, you know, ourself at stake.
Yeah.
Um,
Altruistic.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's kind of natural. I'm a great lawyer for other people. I am not as great a lawyer for myself,
Sure.
because all my stuff comes up, you know, and I can't see it clearly, and that's true for everyone.
Sure.
And then there's the big stuff, you know, where there's something where someone could lose their job, either
Right.
me or the other person, um, and so, you know, you have to pick your battles carefully and decide if that's what you want to do, and it's important to think it through and not just say, oh, hey, you know, this was really, really wrong and somebody should do something. That's an important piece of it. But then it's important to understand what you're getting into and what's going on and what you're dealing with. And so sometimes the right thing is to speak up and to fight the battle. And sometimes the right thing is to just get the hell out of there.
Right.
Because some things can change and other things won't for a while, until the people who are doing it are gone, one way or the other.
Right.
And they will be gone in another generation. They will be gone. This is a transition period. It's
Yeah, they'll be gone
and so
as long as we don't allow it to
perpetuate.
perpetuate in different ways, right? I mean,
Yep. But I do, you know, it's the cat's out of the bag.
right.
You know, we as much as some people would like it to be, we are not going back.
Right. Right. Well, and that's, I think, you know, I mentioned that to you, I think on our last conversation, that, you know, I want to be an optimist, and I am certainly an idealist at heart. And you know, sometimes we've seen different signals of change, and there's a lot of chaos, regardless of what your political leanings or beliefs are. But there's a lot of stuff happening and a lot of change, and there's a lot of, but people are getting more active, and people are being more willing to stand up for the things that they view as injustice. And the thing for me that signaled that we're actually, like, that something major is changing, are all the teacher strikes here in the different states in
Yes.
the US. Because growing up as a, you know, a son of a teacher and a grandson of a teacher, like, I never thought I would see the day when they would actually go on strike. I mean, my mom and I have had many coffee conversations where I've said, you guys hold the power. Like, you could bring communities to their knees and have to pay attention, and then they would put pressure on your state house to get it done, if you shut down the schools. But you will never do that, because, you know, you have a 200-year history of martyring yourself, and, you know, for the children. Like, that's always
Right.
what you do. And the fact that the teachers are rising up, to me, is like, okay, yeah, this, I don't think you can put that genie back in the bottle.
Right.
It will be interesting to see. And I hope that continues to play out in our workplaces. I hope that, you know, I've always felt, or one of the things I felt for the last, I shouldn't say always, but the last, you know, 5 or 10 years. And I've sort of, as I get up and talk in front of leaders at times, it's like, listen, if you look around at, you know, and I would use like Arab Spring as an example, or, you know, when citizens can use Twitter to bring down the government, your employees at some point can organize to get change done. And so if you want, you know, if you don't want that to happen, if you don't want to get run over, if you want to ride that, you should probably be in conversation with them. You should probably be paying attention. So I do think employees have the power to do this. And at some point we're going to start to see, I think we're starting to see some of that happen. But that gives me hope that, particularly for this kind of conversation, that as all the different groups in our workplaces start to understand the power that they have, and if we start to understand the power of advocacy and being together and connecting together, that we can see some real change. We can apply pressure that isn't disruptive or isn't harmful, but will disrupt and move us forward. So.
Well, I mean, that sort of brings me to a question I'd like to ask you, which is, you know, as we see these changes take place, what do you think it will take for men to become more comfortable having women as colleagues and their boss? And what needs to shift, or what could shift to improve that from the men's perspective?
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of times they feel like it's having power taken away or having opportunity taken away.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting dynamics in all of this, and the shift is that, system change or organizational change like this, if you have an organization where it's all white male leaders and we want to become a more inclusive organization, they have to, in order for actual change to happen, that requires the leaders to give, to sort of distribute power, to give away power that they possess, or distribute it to others. And that represents a real issue. And I think that's an issue, I think that's a human issue. When you have power, it's really hard to give it away, or to share it. And so, to your initial question, I find that one interesting. I think it's exposure. I think generally speaking, you get more comfortable working with women and for women by doing it.
Right.
And so, I'm one of the things that has become very clear to me, and it's something that makes other people really uncomfortable, especially men. It makes men uncomfortable when I talk about it. Even some women have pushed back on me, but like, for example, as a speaker, I get asked for referrals to other speakers frequently. And so they'll say, hey, Jason, we really liked your stuff. Do you have any recommendations for our future events or other people that we should talk to? And in the past, I would just kind of have my go-to people that I knew well and I would refer, and all of them were men. And part of it was because there's just more male speakers, and that's who I was familiar with and that's who I knew. But I have intentionally, I had one of my female friends, one of my strong female colleagues that said, hey, one of the very simple things you could do is program yourself with 2 or 3 or a list of female speakers. So when they ask, that you give them female speakers to get more female voices on that stage and whatever. And I think the same is true internally. Like, we need to be giving preferential treatment to promoting women and other minorities into positions, and that's going to piss off some men, because it's, we make this, it should be equal. It should be equal. It hasn't been equal since the beginning of the workplace. And so let's stop pretending like we're merit based. It's ridiculous. It's a difference between equality and equity, and equity, when you're already in a hole 4 feet deep, putting the step at the same height for men and women doesn't make any sense. You've got to close that 4-foot gap in order for them to get on that step. And so we have to create advantages, and we have to promote more women, and we have to make more diverse teams on purpose. And that's how I think it's going to have to come. I don't think it's about, I don't know that you can make men more comfortable without them having exposure. And so I think we just have to create circumstances where we're working in more diverse teams and we're working for women. I've had much better experiences I love working for women, and I love working with women. I have found that, but I can work either way. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that's what I think, from my perspective. I think that's one of the things we have to create better opportunities. So let me close. I see we're at the top of the hour. I want to ask there was a question that was brought up on the live webcast that I want to make sure we get to, because I think it was a really great question, and it came up from a couple of different attendees. So here it is, and this is a question that was addressed specifically to you. What do you feel are the most effective ways to help women claim their own personal power? And sort of relatedly, how should we help them prepare for the backlash they may receive as they do so?
Well, the first thing is to be brave, to find allies, to speak up about the little stuff, because it builds courage to speak up about the bigger stuff, and to pick your battles very carefully, and to understand that you have choices. I mean, we're in a tight labor market where you know you can change jobs, and so find the place that works for you. If you can't change the organization that you're in, change organizations.
Right.
And talk with your feet, because that will make a difference. And the other thing is, if you don't like the way things are working, start your own company. You know, do it yourself. And you know, this is becoming an option.
Right.
And so just, you know that you don't have to tilt at windmills. There are great organizations doing things well, and find them, model them.
Yeah. Awesome.
We are where we are, and it's not about changing somebody who doesn't want to be changed, but there are places that you can find.
When one of the things, and I think you mentioned this, but one of the things I hear more and more frequently, I think particularly with my female colleagues, is like, find your warrior tribe. Like, find people that will lift you up, find people that will protect you, that will have your back, that will reinforce and remind you of your power as you find it, and will support you when the resistance comes, because the resistance will come, and you need somebody to be like, it's not you, it's him, it's them. Stay in it. And so Heather, as we wrap up, we burn quickly through an hour, as we always do. As we close, number one, I want to thank everyone who's listening and has participated with us in this conversation through the video. We hope that the time was valuable, and that it's hopefully sparked some inspiration. Maybe we narrowed the gap of ignorance just a tiny bit, but most importantly, both Heather and I hope that we inspired you to go have some more conversations in your world, in your workplace, with your friends and your communities. We'll be sending a follow-up email here shortly. You may have found the video through that. And we're going to include with it some reference, some sort of references, some additional reading, and some videos and things, some resources that you can go take a look at if you'd like to deepen your understanding and like I have be on a quest to reduce your ignorance. If you are not on that email and you'd like that resource, you can reach out to me at jason@jasonlortzen.com. Just send me an email. I'll make sure you get those resources. May try to get those up on my website via the blog somehow. And Heather, I'm going to give you, I'll defer to you for a closing sort of final thought, or some final thoughts. So what's on your mind as we wrap up today that you'd like to leave us with?
This is really about showing up and being able to be ourselves. At work and in the world and in our lives, and to not have roles or gender or how we look or the color of our skin or who we love define our opportunities. And this is true for men and women. And if we're going to truly create an inclusive environment, we have to look at how our organizations work and how we treat each other within those organizations and the power dynamics involved. It's not just about gender. It's not just about bad behavior. It's a culture issue, and it's a societal issue. And we need to work to build organizations and power structures where people can be heard and thrive, no matter what.
That's perfectly said. I really appreciate you joining us. If people want to reach out to you, Heather, or reach out and find you to engage you in conversation or follow up on something you've talked about today, where can they find you? Well,
I'm Heather Bussing on Twitter, and I just rejoined LinkedIn, so if you want to connect to me there, you can find me. And if you want to ask me a question specifically, it's heather.bussing@gmail.com.
Bussing. Great.
Correct.
All right. And I just gave you my email, and hopefully if you're watching this webcast, you know where to find me. Again, appreciate everyone joining us. And Heather, I love you. Thanks for joining me for this conversation. Can't wait for our next one that's not on video.
Yes.
But we can do it on video anytime too.
Exactly.
But thank you, everyone. Go have great conversations, and please reach out and let us know. If you have a conversation that matters, please share it with us. We'd appreciate it. Have a great
Thank you, Jason. I love you
Thank
too.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.